Welcome to this week's edition of Outdoors Online, a weekly webcast produced by the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. I'm your host, Tom Jensen. My guest this week is Scott Gangl. Scott is a fisheries management section leader with Game and Fish. He and his crews are just finishing up their fall reproduction surveys. Scott, explain to me first of all, what is the fall reproduction survey?
Well, it's a survey that our crews do every fall. They usually start around the end of August in some places and go into the end of September, and they do them over the course of about 6 weeks in the fall. What they're looking for is small fish. They want to know how well reproduction was this year for the fish that naturally reproduce, or how well our stockings took. We stock a lot of fish, mostly walleye and some pike, statewide, and the fall repro is kind of a preliminary look at how well those stockings did. You know, are the fish, did they survive and did they grow, and how big they are going into the winter.
How do they do them?
Well, it's similar to what they do during the summer when they're sampling the adult population. They use nets, but they use nets that are just tailored to catching small fish. So they use a combination of gill nets and small fish trap nets, but they have smaller meshes. So the gill nets are just a very small half-inch mesh that only small fish are going to get tangled in. And then the trap nets are also smaller mesh so that small fish can't escape them. They swim in. It's kind of like a minnow trap, but on a large scale. But they'll swim in and they can't get back out. And they'll assess them that way. Once in a while you'll catch adult fish in there too, and those are counted and released.
Do you do them on every lake in North Dakota? Obviously not.
No, we don't have the time. We've got so many fishing waters right now that we don't have the time to get to all of them. So in a lot of cases we use a combination of our fall reproduction surveys and our summer adult surveys to see how things are going on a particular lake. So we put a little bit more emphasis on the summer surveys. The fall surveys, we want to know, is a new lake that we just stocked, are the fish surviving in there? Are there fish like in a winter kill lake that we may have restocked? How are things doing in there? Some of the big waters, the Missouri River system, Sakakawea, Devil's Lake, we try to keep track of those. Some of our more important waters we monitor regularly, but we can't get to every small water all the time.
You mentioned the Missouri River. Now, we did have some issues during 2011 with the forage, of course, in the flood. What are you finding out about the Missouri River now? Has the forage rebounded well? Have the fish rebounded well?
Well, things are coming back. They're not where they were before the flood. We still haven't seen a major increase in the smelt population in Lake Oahe. We've tried stocking gizzard shad a number of times throughout the system. We've seen some reproduction, but we haven't seen a population become established. They haven't overwintered yet, so we don't have an adult breeding population out there. But what we have seen is a rebound in some of what we call the alternate forages. And we saw that right away after the flood. Some of the things like crappies, white bass, yellow perch, a lot of the minnow species were doing fairly well. And we're still seeing that, and they're kind of carrying the population. We lost a lot of the predator fish starting in about 2012. You know, conditions were really poor. We saw natural mortality take a lot of fish out of the system. And so now the predators are kind of a lower level, and they're starting to build back up, and they're kind of more in balance with the forage that is available out there.
Like you don't have the resources to do all of the lakes in North Dakota, I guess we don't have time to discuss all the lakes in the reproduction survey. So let's just hit some of the high points and some of the nicer lakes that you've found. Well,
you know, it's hard to single out lakes during fall reproduction because you don't want to make too many predictions. What we're looking for is to see how well the fish are surviving and how well they how well that stocking took this year.
Going into
but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make it through the winter. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate into a good fishery. So what we'll do is through our adult population sampling next year determine whether those fish are actually what we call recruited to the population, whether they made it through that first winter, and that's usually the bottleneck. So this is kind of a preliminary look, and we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But what we saw this year wasn't it wasn't remarkable by any means. Some of the newer lakes that we stocked were pretty good in terms of walleye reproduction. Some of the newer
now,
perch
are these
lakes.
Some of the smaller lakes?
Yeah. Some of the smaller lakes were pretty good, but by and large, reproduction and stocking success this year was moderate at best. You know, across the state, it wasn't remarkable and it wasn't poor. It was just kind of average or slightly below average. You asked for some of the high points. One of the high points that we saw pretty good numbers of young of the year walleye on Lake Sakakawea. That one's been doing well for some time. You know, we didn't lose much for forage there during the flood years, and so that population has been building. We still have a lot of smelt in there. So it's kind of promising to see a lot of young of the year walleye. We didn't stock a full stocking this year, so some of that is probably from natural reproduction too. And so that'll give us a little bit of a buffer next year if we don't need to stock as many into Lake Sakakawea because there's a good year class coming on. Other places, some of the other mid-sized reservoirs like Hart Butte and those, we saw some pretty decent catches of young of the year fish. Nothing record-setting, but again, on a statewide basis, this wasn't a record-setting year by any means.
Well, to put that into context, though, Scott, even a mediocre year in North Dakota, coming off some of these really record reproduction years, even an average year is pretty good.
Right, and we're not really concerned at this point with having some low catches because you can kind of expect that when you've got the populations of fish that we do on the landscape. You know, our fisheries are booming right now in terms of adult fish, and we've had a few years of really good water, really good wet years, and that has been translating into good productivity and good stocking success. So we've got a lot of year classes out there, and sometimes when you have really dense fish populations, it'll suppress what's coming up after that. So it's no surprise really that there's going to be some lower years of reproduction and stocking like we're seeing this year. But it's actually no concern either because we've got the fish out there, and typically walleye and other fish will cycle in terms of not producing a year class every year. You don't always get a good year class, so I don't think there's any concerns with having a few or a couple low years. And then,
are there any concerns? Are there any low points that you need to talk about?
Well, I think, you know, in terms of low reproduction, Devil's Lake is one that we didn't see a lot of young of the year walleye on this year. That's one that we see tremendous reproduction when we have a lot of snowpack up in the basin, a lot of runoff. Those fish seem to do really well. This year we didn't have that. There wasn't, and we haven't had that for a couple of years, but we've had really good reproduction since about 2010. So there, you know, Devil's Lake has got a really high abundance of smaller walleye out there, and we've seen some of that reflected in their condition. You know, some of them are a little bit thinner, but they came back a little bit this year, so they're looking a little better. So there again, it's not a big hit to have a low year once in a while in some place like Devil's Lake, but it might just mean that next year we might have to stock a few fish. We really haven't stocked much in Devil's Lake for a number of years. So that's one thing, you know, that's what the reproduction surveys tell us, and it kind of helps us guide our stocking decisions for the coming years.
Looking at the fishing big picture in North Dakota, everything looks pretty rosy, though.
You know, on a statewide scale, again, we've been wet and productive for 5 years or so, and so from a fishing standpoint, from an adult fish standpoint, we still have really good fish populations out there. This 1 year of moderate to below average reproduction statewide probably isn't going to be more than a blip on that. You know, as these fisheries continue to develop, you know, the coming years will be more important probably with water. Are we going to have a dry winter? You know, they're forecasting a warmer than average winter, but we're not sure if it's going to be dry or wet. And so that's going to dictate a lot of what happens next year and whether we're going to have a gradual drying down or an increase in water again. We saw in 2015, a lot of our lakes started losing a little bit of water. If you drive across the state, especially the central part of the state east of Bismarck, a lot of the sloughs, you can see a lot of shoreline around the edge of the water, which, you know, a lot of them lost some water this year, and that's not uncommon in North Dakota when you're talking about these prairie wetlands. You get into August and September, and they tend to be drier months, and evaporation takes a lot of that. Now, if we get some snowfall this winter and get a little bit more runoff, those will come back, and we'll be sitting good.
All right.
But as far as the fall reproduction goes, you know, we're talking little fish, and we're talking fish that probably aren't catchable to anglers just yet. If anybody's interested in where to go fishing or whatever, our guys are going to do a really good job updating our website, our fishing waters list, all of the fishing information. So by probably mid-November, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the adult fish populations are looking like to give to anglers so that they can plan their ice fishing excursions this winter.
Scott, thanks.
You're welcome.
There is a ton of information about fishing in North Dakota on the Game and Fish website at gf.nd.gov. You can find stocking reports to find out which of your favorite lakes have been enhanced with stocked fish. You can find maps that show the contours of all your favorite fishing lakes, even directions to the lake, which species inhabit the lake, and whether or not the lake has boat access or fishing piers. Again, it's all available on the Game and Fish website at gf.nd.gov. For Scott Gangl and the rest of the staff here at North Dakota Game and Fish, thanks for joining us for Outdoors Online. We'll see you again next week.